Welcome to G Fun Facts Online. Forget everything you think you know about Latin American cartels. Gone are the days when the criminal underworld was defined solely by localized drug runners, fiercely guarding their secret cocaine routes in the jungle. Today, the landscape of transnational organized crime in Latin America has undergone a radical, terrifying metamorphosis. Criminal syndicates in the region now operate with the sophistication, diversification, and logistical prowess of massive multinational corporations. They have systematically infiltrated legal supply chains, exploited mass human migration, and weaponized digital finance. In doing so, they have fundamentally altered the socio-economic fabric of the entire Western Hemisphere. Far from being a marginal issue of local public security or a distant problem for law enforcement, organized crime has become a macroeconomic anchor, dragging down the region's true potential. It acts as an aggressive parasite attached directly to the host of Latin America's legitimate markets. It is actively reshaping governance, draining essential resources, and dictating the daily lives of millions of people. To understand the true socio-economic impact of this phenomenon today, we must look far beyond the tragic, sensationalized headlines of violence. We need to examine the actual balance sheets of these illicit empires, look at the hidden taxes levied on everyday citizens, and uncover the environmental plunder that is financing this new underworld. Let us start by looking at what economists call the macroeconomics of violence, or Latin America's hidden tax. In Latin America and the Caribbean, crime is no longer just a distortion of public order. It is a central economic variable. According to extensive studies by the Inter-American Development Bank, violence and organized crime operate as a silent, regressive hidden tax that costs the region approximately 3.5% of its gross domestic product annually. If you want to put that into absolute terms, this staggering figure exceeds $170 billion a year. That is an amount nearly equivalent to the entire region's public spending on education. Imagine taking every dollar meant for schools, teachers, and student futures, and instead burning it in the fires of extortion and security costs. This massive socioeconomic hemorrhage can be divided into three distinct categories. First, private spending on security accounts for roughly 47% of this total cost. Businesses of all sizes, from massive international shipping conglomerates to small, neighborhood corner stores, are forced to divert their hard-earned capital away from innovation, hiring, and expansion. Instead, they must pour that money into hiring private armed guards, armoring their transport vehicles, installing massive surveillance grids, and paying regular extortion fees just to keep their doors open. For multinational corporations and local exporters, crime acts as a literal, transferable risk premium. For example, cargo insurance at Latin American commercial ports is routinely 20 to 50% more expensive than comparable ports in Europe or Asia. That cost is ultimately passed down to consumers worldwide. Second, public spending to combat crime eats up another 31% of that $170 billion. State budgets are becoming increasingly militarized. Governments are channeling desperately needed public funds away from critical infrastructure, public health care, and social safety nets, and redirecting them toward building mega prisons, funding expanded police forces, and launching massive armed interventions. Finally, the loss of human capital accounts for the remaining 22% of the cost. This number represents the lost, lifelong productivity of individuals who are murdered, indefinitely incarcerated, or permanently disabled by violence. It strips the formal economy of its vital workforce and drives a massive, tragic brain drain as educated professionals flee to safer countries, taking their skills and potential economic contributions with them. The International Monetary Fund has concretely quantified this devastating relationship. Looking at recent data from Ecuador, IMF economists found that a mere 1% increase in the local murder rate correlates directly to a drop in the level of overall economic activity of up to 0.5%. Transnational organized crime chokes out foreign direct investment, artificially inflates basic consumer prices, and perpetuates a vicious, generational cycle of poverty and lack of opportunity. Tragically, this poverty is exactly what feeds the very gangs causing the crisis in the first place, giving them an endless supply of desperate recruits. But to understand how these organizations afford to operate on such a massive scale, we have to look at their newest and most lucrative revenue stream. Historically, the illicit economy in Latin America was almost entirely synonymous with cocaine. While drug trafficking remains highly lucrative today, the financial portfolio of transnational crime has radically diversified. In an era marked by rapidly shifting global markets, criminal organizations have discovered a safer, more profitable, and arguably much more destructive enterprise. That enterprise is illegal gold mining. In illegal gold, criminal groups found a highly convenient, brilliant mechanism to launder their dirty drug proceeds while simultaneously generating massive new revenue streams. You see, the problem with cocaine is that it is always cocaine. But illegal gold is entirely different. Once illegally mined gold is smelted down and introduced into the formal global supply chain with forged paperwork, it magically becomes a perfectly legal commodity. It can move freely across international borders, sitting in the vaults of legitimate banks, or inside the microchips of your smartphone. Today, illegal gold consistently out-earns cocaine as a primary revenue source for massive criminal networks in countries like Colombia and Peru. The sheer scale of this illicit extraction is breathtaking. Recent intelligence reports indicate that an astonishing 77% of all gold mined in Ecuador is produced illegally. In Colombia, that number sits at 80%. In Venezuela, it is between 80 and 90%, and roughly 28% in Peru. The profit margins are absolutely phenomenal. In 2024 alone, illegal gold miners operating on just a single Amazon River tributary at the Brazil-Colombia border generated more yearly revenue than the entire annual budget of Brazil's federal anti-deforestation agency. Let that sink in. The criminals have a higher operating budget than the government agencies tasked with stopping them. The socio-economic and environmental tolls of this modern gold rush are deeply intertwined and completely devastating. In the Tapajós River basin of the Brazilian Amazon, the rapid expansion of wildcat mining, known locally as garimpo, has brought catastrophic deforestation and severe mercury contamination of crucial waterways. Entire indigenous communities have been displaced as their ancestral lands are violently torn apart by heavy machinery. But the destruction goes far beyond the natural environment. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime has documented incredibly strong links between this illegal mining and severe human rights abuses. This includes modern-day slavery, rampant human trafficking, and the horrific sexual exploitation of minors in remote mining camps. Massive criminal syndicates, like Brazil's First Capital Command and Colombia's Clan del Golfo, do not just casually participate in this industry, they absolutely control it. They manage the complex logistics, they supply the expensive heavy machinery, and they systematically extort the independent artisanal miners, enforcing their strict rule with lethal violence. This ecosystem of environmental crime threatens global climate stability by destroying the Amazon, all while entrenching a shadow economy that actively erodes the sovereignty of the states involved. As these criminal syndicates amass billions in untraceable capital, their integration into the legitimate, everyday economy has accelerated at a terrifying pace. The Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime refers to this phenomenon as the creation of murky markets, where the traditional, clear distinctions between the licit and illicit worlds simply vanish. The most prominent example of this corporate criminal evolution is Brazil's Primeiro Comando de Capital, or the PCC. Originating as a marginalized prison gang in São Paulo decades ago, the PCC has grown into an unstoppable transnational juggernaut. According to the Brazilian Forum on Public Security, the PCC currently generates over $25 billion annually entirely within the legal economy. They have systematically infiltrated Brazil's massive fuel production chain. They now control everything from actual oil wells and industrial refineries to ordinary urban gas stations. By dominating these legitimate logistical networks, the PCC can effortlessly launder immense amounts of cash while holding significant, dangerous leverage over local economies. Furthermore, the digital age has provided transnational crime with frictionless, high-tech avenues for massive financial crimes. Cyber-dependent crimes, including crippling ransomware attacks against vital state infrastructure, widespread identity theft, and sophisticated cryptocurrency fraud, have surged across the entire region. In a recent case in Brazil, federal authorities dismantled a highly advanced criminal network that had actually created its own custom cryptocurrency. The sole purpose of this digital coin was to launder the massive proceeds of their illegal gold mining operations. This highlights the dizzying technical sophistication of modern cartels. They are no longer just hiring thugs with guns, They are hiring software engineers and financial analysts. To truly grasp the catastrophic socio-economic impact of these groups, we can look at the tragic collapse of Ecuador's national security. Just a decade ago, Ecuador was widely considered a relative island of peace, quietly situated between two massive cocaine-producing giants, Colombia and Peru. Today, it is painfully grappling with an existential security crisis that threatens to tear the nation apart. The country's rapid transformation into a global criminal epicenter was driven almost entirely by its strategic geography. The bustling port city of Guayaquil became a highly coveted logistical node for transnational cartels. Groups like Mexico's infamous Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation cartels, as well as ruthless European Balkan mafias, realized they could use the port to ship massive quantities of cocaine carefully hidden inside massive maritime agricultural exports, particularly bananas. Local Ecuadorian street gangs, such as Los Choneros, Los Lobos, and Los Tiburones, saw an opportunity. They evolved from small-time crooks into deeply entrenched, mafia-style organizations by acting as the outsourced logistical muscle for these global supercartels. The resulting turf wars over port access triggered a terrifying, unprecedented wave of violence. Ecuador's national homicide rate exploded from a peaceful 8 per 100,000 inhabitants in 2020 to roughly 46 per 100,000 in 2023. This sudden spike surpassed notoriously violent nations like Mexico and Honduras. Projections for 2025 estimate the rate could near 50 per 100,000, solidifying Ecuador's tragic new status as one of the deadliest countries in Latin America. The violence reached an absolute crescendo in early 2024 when heavily armed gang members boldly stormed a live national television broadcast, holding journalists hostage on air. This shocking event prompted President Daniel Noboa to declare a formal internal armed conflict against 22 distinct criminal organizations. The socio-economic fallout in Ecuador has been absolutely pervasive. Extortion, known locally as vacunas or vaccines, has become a mandatory parallel tax on everyday survival. Over 10,700 extortion cases were officially reported by late 2024, though the real number is likely much higher. These cartels target everyone from massive corporations to neighborhood corner store owners and even public school teachers. In heavily contested cities like Duran, the state has practically evaporated. Amidst a total vacuum of basic public services like clean water and sanitation, drug traffickers have created a twisted parallel service economy. They provide marginalized, abandoned citizens with warped forms of security and income in exchange for total loyalty. This pervasive environment of fear has choked domestic consumption and triggered a massive, heartbreaking wave of human displacement. Between January and October of 2024 alone, an estimated 80,000 Ecuadorians were internally displaced by the threat of violence. Tens of thousands more made the agonizing decision to flee north through the incredibly treacherous Darien Gap jungle, driven by a toxic combination of total economic stagnation and mortal fear. The government's heavily militarized response, while highly popular with terrified citizens in the short term, has completely drained the public treasury and led to documented human rights abuses. This creates a highly volatile environment that deeply threatens the long-term stability of the nation's democratic institutions. But the story of Latin America's criminal metamorphosis is not just about drugs and gold. While the global drug trade fueled the rise of the Andean cartels, the catastrophic total collapse of the Venezuelan economy gave birth to an entirely different kind of monster. This group is known as Tren de Aragua. Originating deep within Venezuela's notorious Tocorón prison, Tren de Aragua capitalized on the tragic mass exodus of over 7.7 million everyday Venezuelans who were fleeing hyperinflation and strict authoritarianism. Tren de Aragua operates on a highly unique, purely parasitic economic model. Rather than primarily controlling drug production or mining territories, the gang embedded its operatives directly within the vulnerable, chaotic flows of the massive Venezuelan diaspora. As official border crossings were shuttered, Tren de Aragua violently seized control of the irregular, hidden border trails known as trocas. They began systematically extorting desperate migrants simply for the right to flee their own crumbling homeland. As this massive diaspora spread south into Colombia, Peru, and Chile, and north toward the United States, Tren de Aragua faithfully followed their victims. The syndicate established a brilliant but terrifying transnational franchise model based entirely on extreme theatrical violence. They frequently utilize horrific public executions to intimidate local criminal rivals and terrorize local populations. In major international cities like Lima, Peru, and Santiago, Chile, Tren de Aragua engineers horrific human trafficking and forced prostitution rings. They specifically target incredibly vulnerable Venezuelan women, smuggling them across international borders under false pretenses, and violently forcing them into the underground sex industry to pay off completely insurmountable fabricated debts. The group's massive revenue is derived from a highly diversified portfolio of pure human misery. This includes migrant smuggling, brutal kidnapping for ransom, organized retail theft rings, and the systematic, relentless extortion of small businesses owned by the diaspora. Tren de Aragua's rapid, unchecked expansion across the hemisphere has triggered high-level national security alerts from the dry Atacama Desert all the way to major urban centers in the United States. It perfectly demonstrates how modern transnational crime effortlessly weaponizes massive geopolitical crises. The syndicate thrives exactly where the state's social safety net has completely failed. They create deeply violent sleeper cells in vulnerable communities, where migrants, due to their irregular or illegal legal status, cannot safely turn to local law enforcement for protection without risking immediate deportation. All of these raw economic metrics, the billions of dollars successfully laundered, the massive percentages of GDP lost forever, the record-breaking port seizures, often completely mask the profound, lasting psychological and social devastation inflicted on everyday Latin American communities. The deep institutionalization of crime has fundamentally fractured the basic social contract between the state and its citizens. In regions where the official state presence is weak or entirely absent, organized criminal organizations happily step in as the de facto governing authority. They step up to mediate mundane neighborhood disputes, they enforce localized strict curfews to keep rival gangs out, and they even distribute free food and medicine during severe economic downturns. They intentionally weave themselves deep into the community's cultural fabric. This creates a highly tragic, unbreakable dependency. When the state is viewed by the people not as a reliable protector, but as an absent or highly corrupt entity, the local cartel boss effortlessly becomes both the terrifying oppressor and the generous benefactor. This twisted reality has an absolutely devastating impact on the region's youth. Across Latin America, marginalized adolescents who are facing bleak, empty economic prospects and completely failing public education systems are heavily and systematically recruited into criminal ranks. In cities like Guayaquil, Ecuador, and Rosario, Argentina, criminal gangs actively seek out and recruit young minors to act as disposable hitmen and street-level lookouts. They do this to intentionally exploit specific legal loopholes that prevent harsh, adult sentencing for juveniles. This systemic, calculated recruitment is powerfully reinforced by the pervasive, toxic spread of narcocultura. Narcocultura is a massive cultural phenomenon, heavily glorified in mainstream music, popular television dramas, and viral social media trends. It aggressively equates criminal association with immense wealth, unstoppable power, and high social status. For a desperate teenager, living in a forgotten slum with no running water and no future, the cartel offers an immediate, highly alluring, albeit ultimately deadly, avenue for rapid, upward economic mobility. Furthermore, the truly pervasive nature of organized crime fundamentally and deeply corrupts the highest democratic institutions. To ensure the smooth, uninterrupted operation of their massive illicit supply chains, cartels systematically and generously bribe high-level politicians, Supreme Court judges, national police commanders, and vital customs officials. This widespread co-optation literally hollows out the state from the inside out. According to numerous international anti-corruption watchdogs, the massive infiltration of illicit cartel money into legitimate political campaigns across Latin America ensures that any new laws or policies specifically designed to combat money laundering and resource smuggling are routinely watered down or entirely ignored by compromised politicians. This blatant, unchecked impunity breeds incredibly deep public cynicism among the voters. It highly destabilizes legitimate governments and actively paves the way for dangerous authoritarian populism, as terrified, desperate citizens demand immediate security at any absolute cost to their own civil liberties. So how do we fix this? Addressing the massive socio-economic impacts of transnational organized crime in Latin America requires fully acknowledging that the traditional, decades-old war on drugs and the heavily militarized mano dura, or iron fist policies, are completely insufficient. While deploying the national military with tanks and helicopters to forcefully reclaim gang-controlled urban territories or retake massive prisons can yield highly popular, short-term reductions in street violence, it absolutely does not dismantle the underlying multi-billion-dollar economic engine of organized crime. A truly comprehensive, effective regional response must fundamentally treat transnational crime as the highly complex, corporate, and massive economic threat that it truly is. First and foremost, international governments must strategically attack the vital financial lifelines of these massive syndicates. This requires incredibly robust, unprecedented international cooperation to aggressively tackle global money laundering networks. It requires governments to dramatically tighten corporate regulations on anonymous shell companies and implement incredibly strict, high-tech traceability in the physical extraction of highly strategic resources like gold, timber, and rare earth minerals. Without the crucial ability to cleanly integrate their billions of dirty dollars into the formal global banking system and the lucrative international real estate market, the actual operational power of these terrifying syndicates is severely and permanently bottlenecked. Second, the deep, structural socio-economic drivers of crime must be aggressively and meaningfully addressed. True, lasting security simply cannot be achieved without providing real economic opportunity. Reclaiming marginalized, forgotten communities requires massive state intervention that goes far beyond kicking down doors in midnight police raids. It absolutely demands heavy, sustained public investment in vital infrastructure, modern education, and highly legitimate, accessible economic alternatives for the millions of desperate youths and informal workers who currently view the violent, illicit economy as their only possible means of daily survival. Lastly, the massive regional migration crisis must be managed collectively, with a sharp, empathetic focus on quickly integrating vulnerable migrants into the formal, legal economy. Providing safe, legal pathways for migration and immediate access to legal work permits completely strips predatory organizations like Tren de Aragua of their most vulnerable, profitable prey. It instantly cuts off a massive, primary source of their extortion and human trafficking revenues. Transnational organized crime in the 21st century is an incredibly evolving, highly adaptive hydra that actively feeds on systemic economic inequality, profound institutional weakness, and the voracious, endless global demand for illicit commodities. The ultimate battle for Latin America's future is no longer just being fought with rifles in the remote jungles or on the bloody city streets. It is being strategically waged in high-rise corporate boardrooms, across unregulated global financial markets, and deep within the most marginalized, forgotten neighborhoods. Reclaiming the entire region's massive economic potential and restoring its democratic integrity absolutely demands a highly unified, structurally deep, and incredibly relentless commitment. We must work together to completely dismantle this massive shadow economy before it wholly consumes the light. Thank you for listening to G Fun Facts Online. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we will see you next time.